No name on any official record. The military didn't even acknowledge she existed.
I have to go.
But when a Navy
Please
SEAL
don't,
commander,
it's too dangerous.
a man who had
It's my
survived
duty.
3
I
wars,
must.
2
Come back
gunshot
to me.
wounds, and 1 helicopter
All
crash,
clear.
saw
Copy,
her
standing
walking
by.
across
Engage
that
on my
dusty
mark.
base in the middle of nowhere, he stopped dead in his tracks, turned to face her, and saluted. Not because he was ordered to, not because protocol demanded
I
it,
have to go.
but because he knew
Please
what she
don't,
had
it's
done
too
out there in the
dangerous.
dark,
It's my duty.
alone,
I must.
Come
with
back
nothing
to
but
me.
a rifle and a decision
All
that
clear.
would change the
Copy,
course of a
standing by.
covert operation
Engage on
that
my
the
mark.
United States government still refuses to talk about. This is her story, and the fact that you've never heard it, that's exactly the point. If you love your mom,
I
if you
have
love
to
your
go.
dad,
Please
if you believe
don't,
that
it's
real
too
heroes
dangerous.
sometimes wear
It's
no
my duty.
uniform
I
and carry
must.
no
Come
title,
back to me.
hit that subscribe
All
button
clear.
right now and
Copy,
show some
standing
love
by.
to the people
Engage
who
on
fight
my
in the
mark.
shadows so the rest of us can sleep at night. This one's for them. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the desert at 3 in the morning. It is not the comfortable silence of a bedroom or the peaceful silence of a library. It is something older and heavier. A silence that presses against your chest like a hand, that makes the sound of your own heartbeat feel like a betrayal. It is the silence that soldiers learn to fear, because in that silence, anything can happen, and everything that happens in that silence tends to be permanent. On a night that the United States government has officially classified, in a location that has never appeared on any press release, a woman lay flat against the earth with her cheek pressed against the stock of a precision rifle. She had been in that position for 11 hours. She had not eaten. She had taken 2 small sips of water from a tube connected to a reservoir in her pack, and she had done so slowly, carefully, with the discipline of someone who understood that the slightest movement in the wrong moment could cost lives. Not just her own, but the lives of the men who were counting on her from a position nearly 800 meters away. Her name does not appear in this story. That is not an oversight. That is the agreement. That is the price she paid for doing what she did, and she paid it willingly, which tells you almost everything you need to know about the kind of woman she was. What we know about her comes from fragments, from after-action reports that were partially declassified, from statements made by operators who were present, from a single interview conducted by a military historian who agreed to keep identifying details sealed for 20 years. What emerges from those fragments is not a legend. Legends are comfortable things, polished smooth by repetition. What emerges is something rawer and more complicated. A portrait of a human being who made choices in circumstances that most people cannot even imagine, and who lived with every one of those choices afterward with clear eyes and a steady hand. She grew up in a small town in the American Midwest, the kind of town where Friday nights meant high school football and Sunday mornings meant church, where everybody knew your name and most people assumed they knew your future. Her father was a veteran, a man who had served in Vietnam and come home changed in the ways that generation of veterans came home changed. Quieter than he used to be, with distances in his eyes that his family learned not to ask about. But he was a good man, and he loved his daughter with the particular ferocity of a father who has seen enough of the world to know how precious ordinary happiness is. He taught her to shoot when she was 9 years old, not because he wanted to make her into a weapon, because he wanted her to understand discipline. He wanted her to understand that there are things in this world that demand your complete and total attention, and that the ability to give that attention, to quiet everything inside you and focus with perfect stillness on a single point, is one of the most valuable skills a human being can possess. She learned fast. She learned faster than he expected. By the time she was 14, she was shooting better than most of the adult men at the range where her father was a member, and she was doing it without arrogance, without performance, with a calm that made some of those men uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. She was not the kind of girl who dreamed of military service in any conventional sense. She was not drawn by the posters or the recruitment videos or the idea of glory. What drew her, when it finally drew her, was something much simpler and more difficult to explain. She had a sense, deep, instinctive, impossible to reason away, that she was built for something that most people weren't built for. Not better than them. Not superior. Just differently configured. Like some people are built to run marathons or perform surgery or translate languages simultaneously in real time. She was built to be still. She was built to wait. She was built to make the hardest decision a human being can make, and to make it without hesitation, and to live with it. She joined the army at 18. She excelled immediately, not in a flashy way but in the relentless, grinding way that impresses senior instructors more than any display of natural talent. She did everything asked of her and then did more. She volunteered for the assignments nobody else wanted. She stayed late. She arrived early. She asked questions that her instructors remembered weeks later because the questions revealed a level of thinking that was genuinely unusual. She was thinking about angles and wind and human behavior and decision trees in situations of extreme stress, and she was doing it with a precision that her instructors found almost unsettling. She applied for sniper school. She was rejected. This was not a surprise to anyone who understood how the military worked at that time, and it was not, if we are being honest, a surprise to her. But rejection is not the same as defeat, and she understood the difference with a clarity that would define her career. She kept training. She kept refining. She built her own curriculum from technical manuals and physics textbooks and conversations with anyone who would talk to her about ballistics, about atmospherics, about the psychology of long-range shooting. She sought out a retired Marine sniper who lived 2 hours from her base and drove to see him on weekends, and he taught her things that were not in any manual because they were the kind of knowledge that lives in hands and eyes and muscle memory rather than on pages. Her opportunity came from a direction nobody anticipated. It came from the intelligence community, which operated by different rules than the conventional military and was, by that point in the post-September 11 world, desperately hungry for capabilities that the conventional pipeline wasn't producing fast enough. She was approached by a recruiter who had reviewed her file and who spoke to her for 3 hours in a conference room that had no windows. What was said in that room is not known. What is known is that she walked in as a soldier and walked out as something harder to classify, an asset, a specialist, a person whose skills were now the property of a program that didn't have a name on any organizational chart that the public would ever see. The training that followed was the most brutal period of her life. She has said this herself, in the partially available interview, with a directness that leaves no room for romanticization. She has said that there were moments during that training when she questioned everything she thought she knew about her own limits, when the gap between who she believed herself to be and what her body and mind were actually capable of producing felt like a chasm she might not be able to cross. She crossed it. She crossed it because the alternative was not an option she was willing to accept. But she crossed it bleeding, in ways that weren't always visible. By the time she was deployed for the first time, she was 26 years old. She was, on paper, nobody. She had a cover identity, a backstory, a set of documents that told a story about her life that bore only a passing resemblance to the truth. She operated in a unit that technically didn't exist, supporting operations that were technically not happening, in places that the United States was technically not present. This is the world of special operations at the classified level, a world built on negation, on the careful construction of official absence, and she inhabited it with a fluency that suggested she had been made for exactly this. Her first confirmed engagement was at a range of 620 meters. The conditions were poor, a crosswind that was shifting unpredictably, dust that reduced visibility in ways that required constant adjustment, a target that was moving rather than stationary. She made the shot. The operation continued, and because of that shot, for members of a Special Forces team extracted safely from a position that had been compromised. None of those 4 men knew who had made the shot. They knew someone had because they were alive when they shouldn't have been, and in the world they inhabited, you learn to be grateful for things without always knowing the source of your gratitude. She made 11 confirmed engagements over the course of her operational career. Each one is documented in a file that remains classified. Each one, according to the fragments that have been made available, was taken under conditions that qualified shooters have described as extraordinarily difficult. Not one of them was what you would call a clean, simple textbook shot. Each one was a problem of physics and weather and human behavior and moral calculation that she solved in real time under pressure with consequences that were measured in lives. But it is the 12th situation, the one that was not a shot, the one that was a decision not to shoot, that defines her in ways that the 11 confirmed engagements do not. And it is this situation, pieced together from multiple accounts and a single declassified summary, that brings us to the night that changed everything. The operation had been months in the planning. A high-value target, someone whose removal from the operational landscape would, according to intelligence assessments, disrupt a network responsible for multiple attacks on American personnel, had been located. The plan was a direct action raid by a SEAL team, a precision strike that would go in fast and come out faster, with the target either neutralized or captured depending on circumstances. Her role was overwatch, Positioned on high ground at approximately 800 meters, she would provide eyes on the objective and eliminate any threats that emerged to compromise the team's approach or extraction. What the intelligence had not accounted for, what intelligence almost never accounts for, because intelligence is a story about the past being used to predict the future, and the future has its own ideas, was the presence of civilians. Specifically, the presence of a large group of civilians who had gathered in a building adjacent to the objective for reasons that became clear only in hindsight. There was a wedding, a celebration modest by any standard, but a human gathering, families, children, old people, young couples, that had materialized in the worst possible location at the worst possible time. The SEAL team was already moving. They were committed. The intelligence picture that her position gave her was better than anything the team had on the ground, because elevation and optics give you a kind of truth that ground-level perspective cannot. She could see what the team could not. She could see that the approach path the team was using was going to bring them into a situation that the plan had not anticipated, and she could see that the way the situation was developing, there was a high probability of a catastrophic outcome. Not just for the operation, but for the civilians who had no idea what was moving toward them in the dark. She called it, over the communications network, using the clipped, precise language of Special Operations Radio Protocol, she described what she was seeing. The situation unfolded in the way these situations always unfold in real operations, which is to say that it unfolded badly, with the clarity of hindsight available only to people who are not the ones making decisions in real time. There was disagreement on the net. There were voices that wanted to push through, to continue the mission, to accept the complexity of the situation as a cost of doing the operation. There were voices that understood what she was describing and recognized that the cost she was talking about was not an acceptable one. The operation was paused. Not canceled. Paused. And in that pause, something happened that nobody had planned for and nobody would have predicted. The high-value target moved. He moved from the objective building to the adjacent building, the building with the wedding, the civilians, the children. Whether this was coincidence or whether it represented some level of operational awareness on his part has never been definitively established. What it represented, from her perspective at 800 meters, was a situation that had just become dramatically more complicated in every direction simultaneously. She had eyes on him. She had a shot, a difficult shot, a shot that would have required threading through a window opening at a distance and in conditions that pushed the absolute edge of what was technically achievable, but a shot that her assessment told her was makeable. She had the target. She had the angle. She had, in the language of her world, a solution, and she did not take it. This is the moment. This is the decision that, when it was fully understood by the people in positions of authority who were eventually read into what had happened, produced reactions ranging from fury to awe. She did not take the shot because her assessment of the situation told her that the margin for error was smaller than the risk to the civilians in that room. She had done the calculation, and this is not metaphor, this is literal. She had run the numbers in her head in real time, and her conclusion was that the probability of an outcome that killed or seriously wounded civilians was higher than she was willing to accept, regardless of the value of the target. She communicated her decision. She communicated her reasoning. And then she did something that very few people in her position, in that moment, would have had either the clarity or the courage to do. She recommended an alternative. She had been watching the building, tracking movement, reading the patterns of activity with the patience of someone who had spent 11 hours lying still in the dark, and she had identified something. There was a moment coming, she estimated 10 to 12 minutes, when the target would almost certainly step outside. A path, a gap, a window in the literal sense and the tactical sense simultaneously, that would give her a clean engagement without the civilian risk. She was right. Not in 10 minutes, but in 14, which in the context of that situation was close enough to count as a prophecy. The target moved. He stepped outside. And she made the shot. The SEAL team completed the operation. The extraction was clean. Nobody in that wedding knew what had happened in the darkness outside. And they went home the next morning the way people go home from weddings, with tired feet and good memories and the ordinary miracle of having been somewhere joyful. The SEAL commander, a man with a career that was itself a classified document, a man who had earned every decoration that could be earned and some that couldn't be named, was read into the full account of what had happened during the debrief. He was told about the pause. He was told about the decision not to take the shot. He was told about the alternative she had identified and waited for. He was told about the 14 minutes she had spent watching and waiting and holding the solution to a problem that most operators would have solved differently. He asked to meet her. This was unusual. In the world she operated in, the architecture of compartmentalization meant that people from different programs didn't meet, didn't interact, didn't know each other's names. The request itself required a level of authorization that was, by any measure, extraordinary. But it was granted because the commander was the kind of person whose requests tended to be granted, and because the people who made those decisions understood that what had happened in that desert was significant enough to warrant the exception. They met in a room on a forward operating base. She was in civilian clothes. He was in uniform. He walked in, he looked at her, and he stopped. He stood there for a moment that people who witnessed it have described as extending much longer than it actually did, in the way that certain moments do when they carry enough weight. And then he brought his hand up and he saluted her. She did not have a rank he was required to recognize. She had no uniform, no insignia, no designation that put her within the military hierarchy in any conventional sense. He saluted her because he chose to, because his assessment of what she had done and how she had done it and what it had cost her to do it was such that the gesture felt not like protocol but like truth. She returned the salute. They sat down. What they said to each other in that room is not on record anywhere. The people who were present have been consistent on one point. The conversation lasted approximately 40 minutes, and when she left, the commander sat alone in the room for several minutes before anyone spoke to him, and when his operations officer finally asked him if he was all right, he said something that has been repeated in slightly different forms by the various people who heard it, and which amounts to this, that in 30 years of service, in 3 wars and countless operations, he had never been so comprehensively reminded of what this work was supposed to be about. What happened to her after that night is a story that exists in the space between what can be said and what can't, which is to say it is a story that belongs to her and to the classification system simultaneously, and those two owners are not always in agreement about what to release. What is known is that she continued to serve for several more years. What is known is that the decisions she made on that night, particularly the decision not to shoot, were written into training frameworks that were used to teach a subsequent generation of operators about the kind of judgment that cannot be taught from a manual. What is known is that she eventually left the operational world. She left it on her own terms, which is not something everyone gets to do, and which represents a kind of victory that doesn't come with a medal but is recognized by people who understand what it means. She went back to a life that was, at least on the surface, ordinary. A house, community, the kind of existence that most people take for granted and that she had spent years fighting to preserve for people she would never meet. People who know her in that life. Neighbors, people she sees at the grocery store, people whose children go to school with children she is close to, have described her in ways that are consistent and that collectively amount to a portrait of someone who is completely present in the moment and somehow, simultaneously, operating on a frequency that most people don't have access to. She is calm in ways that other people aren't. She notices things. She pays attention with a completeness that can feel, to the uninitiated, slightly unnerving. Not because there is anything threatening about her, but because most people are not accustomed to being genuinely seen. She coaches youth shooting sports. This is not irony. This is, if you understand who she is and what she believes, the most logical thing in the world. She teaches young people, boys and girls, in roughly equal numbers, because she believes in equal numbers with a conviction that comes from lived experience, to be still, to be patient, to understand that the relationship between a shooter and a target is, at its foundation, a relationship between a mind and a problem, and that the quality of the mind matters more than almost anything else. She does not tell them stories about what she has done. She does not need to. The quality of her attention, the depth of her knowledge, the way she can look at a young person's stance and posture and breathing pattern and identify exactly what needs to change. These things communicate everything that needs to be communicated. There is a story, unverified, but told by multiple people who claim to have been present, about a day at that range when a man arrived who was not one of her students. A man in his late 50s, well-built, with a bearing that was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around senior military personnel. He watched her work for about 20 minutes, standing off to the side with his arms crossed, not interfering, just watching. When she was finished with the group of kids she was working with and walked over to him, he introduced himself, a name that, again, does not appear in this story, and told her that he had heard about her coaching program and wanted to see it for himself. They talked for a while. At some point during the conversation, one of the kids, a 12-year-old girl who was, by all accounts, showing the kind of early potential that coaches recognize and try not to put too much pressure on, made a shot that was, for her age and experience level, genuinely remarkable. The man watched it happen. He looked at the girl, and then he looked at the coach, and something passed between them that the people who were there have described as a moment of mutual understanding so complete that it didn't require words. She is building something. This is the conclusion that people who have watched her reach, each independently, over years of observation. She is taking what she knows, not just the technical knowledge, not just the physical discipline, but the deeper knowledge, the knowledge about patience and decision-making and the weight of responsibility and the absolute necessity of seeing clearly when clarity is the hardest thing to achieve, and she is passing it on. Not to future operators, necessarily. To future human beings. To a generation of young people who will grow up in a world that will require from them the ability to be still in a storm, to see clearly when everything is moving fast, to make the right decision when the wrong one is easier and the stakes are high. This is what legacy looks like when it belongs to someone who cannot claim it publicly. It is quiet. It is built one person at a time. It is invisible to anyone who doesn't know what to look for, and unmistakable to anyone who does. The SEAL commander, when he was later interviewed as part of a broader oral history project about special operations culture, was asked about the most memorable moment of his career. He gave an answer that the interviewer did not expect, and the interviewer, a man who had spent years conducting such interviews and who was not easily surprised, sat forward in his chair when he heard it. The commander did not describe a firefight. He did not describe a rescue or a capture or a moment of personal physical courage under fire. He described a room on a forward operating base and a woman in civilian clothes and a salute that he gave not because any regulation required it, but because it was the truest thing he could do in that moment. He was asked what made her different. He thought about the question for a long time before answering, which was itself unusual for a man known for decisive communication. What he eventually said was this: that the hardest thing in his world was not pulling the trigger. The hardest thing was knowing when not to. And that he had met, in 30 years of service, very few people who understood that distinction with the completeness and the lived certainty that she did. He said that what she had done on that night, the waiting, the watching, the discipline of not taking the available solution because her judgment told her it was the wrong one, and then identifying the right one and waiting for it with absolute patience, was the highest expression of what this work was supposed to be. He paused. Then he said something else, quietly, that the interviewer almost missed. He said that he thought about her sometimes when things got hard. Not as a source of inspiration in any sentimental sense. As a reference point. As a calibration tool. When his own judgment felt uncertain, when the calculus of a situation seemed irresolvable, he thought about someone lying in the dark for 11 hours, making the hardest decision possible and getting it right. She does not know he said this. Or perhaps she does. The world she moved through for the years she operated in it was smaller and more interconnected than it appeared from outside, and information moved through it in ways that defied the formal structures of classification and compartmentalization. But whether she knows or not is, in some sense, beside the point. The point is what she did. The point is who she was in the moment that mattered. The point is that somewhere in a file that most people will never read, in language that is technical and dry and deliberately stripped of drama, there is a record of a decision that saved lives. Not just the lives of the operators who extracted cleanly, not just the lives of the civilians in that building, but in some real sense the life of the idea that this work can be done with wisdom as well as lethality. The United States military has, over the course of its history, produced many heroes. It has produced them in every branch and every era and every configuration of conflict that history has offered up for it to navigate. Most of those heroes are named. Most of them have records and medals and official documentation of what they did and why it mattered. The institution that produced them is, whatever its failings, and its failings are real and significant and deserve their own accounting, genuinely good at recognizing and honoring the people who serve it with distinction. But there is another category of hero. A category that exists in the space where official recognition cannot follow, where the very act of acknowledgement would compromise the work, where the sacrifice of anonymity is itself part of the service. These are people who have agreed, in the fullest and most binding sense, to be nobody, to have done what they did and to carry that in silence, without the validation that most human beings need and most heroes receive. To know what they know about themselves, to have been tested at the absolute edge of human capability and to hold that knowledge privately without audience, without ceremony. She is one of those people. And the fact that a SEAL commander, a man who had given his life to service and who understood better than almost anyone what service at its highest level looked like, chose to salute her in an unofficial room with no protocol requiring it and no audience to perform it for, that fact is its own form of record. Its own form of recognition. It happened in the way the most important things happen, quietly between people who understood exactly what it meant, in a room with no windows. Remember her name? You don't have it. Neither does history officially. But you know who she is now. You know what she did. You know what it cost her and what it meant and what the man who saluted her was saying when he raised his hand. That is more than most people get. And for someone who spent her career becoming nobody so that others could come home, it might be exactly enough. Now tell us something. We want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments right now. Which part of this great country are you watching from? Are you out there on the West Coast, maybe looking at the Pacific and feeling that wide-open distance? Are you somewhere in the Midwest, in a town that looks a little like the one where she grew up? Are you in the South, in the Northeast, up in the mountains, down near the Gulf? Are you on a military base somewhere, watching this and thinking about people you know who carry stories like hers? Tell us where you are. Because this story is for all of you, from every corner of this country, and we want to know you're out there.